Lonely rancher married a dying mail-order bride. Then she lived and exposed his secret past. He married a dying woman because he thought his secrets would die with her. But when she lived, she started asking questions that could destroy everything he'd built on blood and lies. The letters came to Thomas Whitmore like prayers to a godless man, desperate, hopeful, and carrying the weight of borrowed time. Clara's handwriting was delicate as spider silk, each word carefully chosen as if ink were precious as water in drought season. She wrote about dying the way other women wrote about spring planting, with a matter-of-fact acceptance that made his chest tighten in ways he couldn't name. "I have perhaps 6 months, maybe less," her first letter had said. "The doctor speaks of consumption like it's already won the war. I don't seek pity, Mr. Whitmore, only honesty. If you want a wife who'll keep your house and warm your bed until winter takes her, I can be that. Nothing more, nothing less." Thomas had folded that letter with hands that still trembled when he thought too hard about Sarah Martinez. 8 years had passed since her blood soaked into the dusty street of Millfield. 8 years since he'd traded his outlaw name for honest work and sleepless nights. He'd built his ranch from nothing, stone by stone, fence post by fence post, each board hammered down like another nail in the coffin of Jesse Brennan, the man he used to be. The ranch house stood against the Wyoming landscape like a prayer carved from timber and hope. But it was too quiet. The silence pressed against him during the long winter months, filled itself with echoes of gunshots and a woman's dying scream. He needed something to drown out the ghosts, even if that something was temporary as morning frost. Clara's second letter had arrived with the spring thaw, and her words painted pictures of a life half-lived. She wrote about teaching school children in Ohio, about apple trees that would bloom without her, about a trunk full of dresses she'd never wear to church socials. There was no self-pity in her sentences, only a quiet dignity that reminded Thomas of his mother's way of facing hardship. Chin up, shoulders straight, heart breaking in private. "I've saved enough for the train fare," she'd written. "If you'll have me, I could bring my books, my sewing machine. And whatever time the Lord sees fit to grant. I ask only for kindness and a place to rest when the coughing gets bad." He'd written back that same night, his own pen scratching across paper like a man, signing his own confession. He told her about the ranch, about the way the mountains looked in morning light, about how he'd been alone so long he'd forgotten the sound of another person's footsteps on his porch. He didn't tell her about Jesse Brennan. He didn't tell her about Sarah Martinez. He didn't tell her about the locked drawer in his desk where he kept newspaper clippings that yellowed with guilt and a wanted poster with his younger face staring back like an accusation. The correspondence had stretched through summer like a bridge built over dangerous water. Clara wrote about small things, the way sunlight fell through her boarding house window, the taste of wild strawberries, the feeling of children's laughter echoing in empty schoolrooms. Thomas found himself looking forward to her letters with an hunger that surprised him. He began timing his trips to town around mail delivery, began checking his reflection in the mirror before reading her words, as if she could somehow see him through the paper. But it was Clara's honesty about dying that freed him to write with something approaching truth. To a woman counting her remaining breaths, he could confess his loneliness without shame. He could admit that some nights he talked to his horses just to hear another voice answer back. He could describe the way guilt sat in his stomach like spoiled meat, though he never named what he was guilty of. When her final letter arrived announcing her departure date, Thomas spent 3 days cleaning his house with the devotion of a man preparing for judgment. He scrubbed floors that were already clean, organized shelves that needed no organizing. In practice conversations, he'd never have the courage to speak aloud. The locked drawer stayed locked. Some truths were meant to stay buried. The train wheezed into Laramie Station like a dying animal, black smoke mixing with gray sky until the whole world looked washed in ash. Thomas waited on the platform with his hat in his hands and his heart hammering against his ribs like something trying to escape. When Clara stepped down from the passenger car, she was smaller than he'd imagined, more fragile, her dress hanging loose on a frame that consumption had whittled down to bone and determination. But her eyes held depths that made him think of mountain lakes, clear and dark and deeper than any man had right to expect. When she smiled at him, really smiled, not the polite grimace he'd expected from a woman facing her own death, something inside his chest cracked open like ice in spring. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying the rasp he'd heard described in her letters, but somehow softer, more musical than he'd dared hope. "Thank you for answering a dying woman's prayers." He wanted to tell her she was answering his prayers, not the other way around. Instead, he took her small traveling bag and helped her into his wagon, noticing how her hand felt like bird bones wrapped in silk. The ride to his ranch passed in comfortable quiet, broken only by Clara's occasional cough and the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. She looked at everything: the rolling grassland, the distant mountains, the way afternoon light turned the world golden, like a woman trying to memorize paradise before the gates close forever. "It's beautiful," she said finally, her words barely louder than the wind. "I can see why you love it." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. He did love this land, but it had never felt complete until this moment. But he saw it reflected in someone else's wonder. Clara made the familiar landscape feel new again, made him remember why he'd chosen this particular stretch of nowhere to build his penance. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in the small church at Laramie, witnessed by the preacher's wife and a rancher from the neighboring spread. Clara wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and when she spoke her vows, her voice carried clear and strong despite the cough that lived in her chest like a patient wolf. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, she promised. And Thomas felt each word like a physical weight settling on his shoulders. She meant those words. This woman who'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger and die in his arms meant every syllable. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her gently, afraid she might break beneath his touch. She tasted like hope and medicine, like all the prayers he'd never learned to say. But as they drove home through the gathering dusk, Clara's keen eyes cataloged everything with the intensity of someone who'd spent months studying human nature from a deathbed. She noticed how Thomas's jaw tightened when they passed certain people on the street, how his eyes avoided the cemetery gates, how his hands gripped the reins too tight whenever someone called his name. That night, as she unpacked her few belongings in what was now their bedroom, Clara found herself wondering what kind of man sought out a dying wife with such desperate urgency. In her experience, men who courted death in others usually carried plenty of it themselves. The locked drawer in his desk caught her attention immediately, and though she said nothing, Clara filed it away in the careful catalog of mysteries that was becoming her new husband's life. She was supposed to die quietly, but when the medicine started working and her lungs cleared, she began seeing things her husband desperately needed to stay buried. The morning Clara woke without coughing, Thomas knew his prayers had been answered in the cruelest way possible. She sat up in bed, drew a full breath that didn't catch or rattle, and smiled at him with eyes that seemed clearer than they had any right to be. The consumption that was supposed to claim her by Christmas was retreating like a beaten enemy, leaving behind a woman who was very much alive and dangerously observant. "The air here," she said, stretching her arms toward the window where golden light painted the floorboards. "It's like drinking life itself." Thomas forced a smile that felt like swallowing glass. He'd married Clara expecting to bury her by spring, to tend a brief flame until winter snuffed it out. Instead, she was growing stronger every day, asking questions that cut too close to bone, watching him with the careful attention of someone who'd spent months studying the subtle language of human secrets. 3 weeks into their marriage, Clara began exploring the ranch with the methodical thoroughness of a woman reclaiming lost time. She wandered through the barn, ran her fingers along fence posts, stood in doorways Thomas had avoided for years. Her health returned in waves, first the color in her cheeks, then the steadiness in her step, finally the sharp curiosity that consumption had kept sleeping. It was in the barn where she found the first piece of his puzzle. Thomas came looking for her at dinner time and discovered her standing beside the old grain bin, holding a crumpled newspaper that should have been burned years ago. The headline screamed in faded ink, "3 dead in Millfield bank robbery, gunman still at large." This was tucked behind some loose boards, Clara said without looking up from the paper. Her voice carried no accusation, only the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous conversations. Strange thing to keep in a barn. Thomas felt his throat close like a fist was squeezing it. Found it when I bought this place. Previous owner left all kinds of trash behind. Clara nodded slowly, folding the paper with movements precise as a seamstress measuring cloth. Of course, though it's odd how well preserved it is for barn trash. She looked at him then, and her eyes held depths he couldn't read. The woman who died, Sarah Martinez. Pretty name. The sound of Sarah's name spoken aloud hit Thomas like a physical blow. He turned away, busying himself with checking hay bales that didn't need checking. Tragic thing. Innocent people caught in bad men's business. Yes, Clara agreed quietly. Tragic indeed, but she didn't let it rest. Over the following days, Clara's recovered strength transformed into persistent curiosity. She asked careful questions about his past, listened to his answers with the attention of someone solving a puzzle. When Thomas claimed he'd been born in Wyoming, she wondered aloud why his accent carried hints of Texas drawl. When he said he'd always been a rancher, she noticed how his hands held a hammer like someone more familiar with gun grips. The locked drawer became a silent presence between them, sitting in his desk like a secret too heavy to carry, but too dangerous to confess. Clara never asked about it directly, but Thomas caught her looking at it sometimes, her expression thoughtful as morning mist. It was during her 4th week of surprising recovery that Clara made her most dangerous discovery. She'd been picking wildflowers for the kitchen table, following a path that led behind the house where Thomas never walked. The small grave marker stood among the sagebrush like a finger pointing toward heaven, weathered wood carved with simple words. Sarah Martinez, gone too soon. Forgive me. Clara knelt beside the grave, her recovered hands tracing letters carved by guilt-shaken fingers. The flowers she'd picked suddenly felt inappropriate, too cheerful for whatever sorrow lived in this hidden place. She understood now why Thomas never walked this path, why his eyes sometimes held the hollow look of a man talking to ghosts. When she returned to the house, Thomas was waiting in the kitchen, his face pale as winter sky. He'd seen her coming from the grave, had watched through the window as his carefully buried past rose from the earth to meet his wife's searching eyes. "You found her," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara set the wildflowers on the table between them like evidence in a trial. "You loved her. I killed her." The words fell into the space between them heavy as stones dropped in still water. Clara's breath caught, not from consumption this time, but from the terrible weight of truth finally spoken aloud. She looked at this man she'd married, this stranger who'd saved her life by giving her purpose, and saw him clearly for the first time. Thomas stood in his own kitchen like a man facing execution, waiting for her judgment, waiting for her to pack her recovered life and leave him alone with his ghosts. The locked drawer seemed to pulse with all the confessions still waiting to be born, all the blood-stained truths that would follow if she stayed long enough to ask the right questions. Clara reached across the table and touched his hand. Her fingers, no longer trembling with sickness, traced the scars on his knuckles, scars that told stories of violence he'd never shared. "Tell me," she said simply. And in the growing darkness of their kitchen, with Sarah's name hanging between them like a prayer for the dead, Thomas began to understand that some graves refuse to stay buried, and some truths demand their reckoning regardless of how much time has passed or how desperately a man might wish for his sins to die with someone else's silence. When she found the grave behind his house with another woman's name on it, he finally told her the truth, and she realized she hadn't married a rancher at all, and a killer trying to atone. The confession spilled out of Thomas like blood from a reopened wound, 8 years of silence, finally broken by the weight of Clara's unwavering gaze. They sat across from each other in the lamplight. The kitchen table transformed into a confessional where absolution seemed as distant as the stars outside their window. "My name wasn't always Thomas Whitmore," he began, his voice barely louder than the wind rattling the windows. "I was Jesse Brennan once. Part of a gang that thought the world owed us something we could only take with guns." Clara's hands remained folded on the table, steady as prayer. But he saw her breath catch when he spoke his real name. Jesse Brennan. Even she had heard that name whispered in the careful way people spoke of dangerous things they hoped would never touch their lives. "We hit banks mostly. Small towns where the sheriff was old and the vault was older." Thomas stared at his hands as he spoke, seeing them as they used to be, younger, quicker, stained with choices that couldn't be washed clean. Never meant to hurt anyone. That was the lie I told myself every time we rode into another town with masks over our faces and hell in our hearts. The lamp flame flickered, casting shadows that danced across his face like memories he couldn't escape. Clara watched him with eyes that had seen death approach and retreat, eyes that understood how desperately people could lie to themselves when the truth was too heavy to carry. "Millfield was supposed to be easy," Thomas continued, his voice growing rougher with each word. "Small bank, sleepy town, in and out before anyone knew we were there. But something went wrong. The bank manager tried to be a hero, went for a gun we didn't know he had. My partner, Billy Crenshaw," he panicked. Clara closed her eyes, already knowing what came next, already understanding why this man had sought out a dying woman to share his bed and take his secrets to an early grave. Billy's shot went wide. Hit Sarah Martinez instead. Thomas's voice cracked like dry wooden fire. She was just depositing her father's store earnings. 22 years old, engaged to the blacksmith's son, full of dreams about wedding dresses and babies and growing old in the house her father was building for her. The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge over dangerous water. Clara opened her eyes and saw tears tracking down Thomas's weathered cheeks. The first tears she'd witnessed from a man who carried grief like a stone in his chest. "I held her while she died," he whispered, right there in the street, with her blood soaking into the dust, and her eyes looking at me like she was trying to understand how the world could be so cruel. "She asked me to tell her mother she wasn't afraid. Asked me to promise her fiancé would find someone else to love." Clara felt her own eyes burn, not with the sting of consumption, but with the salt of shared sorrow. She understood now why Thomas had built his ranch so far from other people, why he'd sought a wife who would ask no questions and leave no lasting mark on his carefully constructed penance. "The others rode off," Thomas continued. "Left me there with Sarah's blood on my hands and her voice in my head asking for promises I didn't know how to keep. I should have run too. Should have disappeared into Mexico or California like Billy and the rest. Instead, I buried her myself." He gestured toward the window, toward the hidden grave Clara had discovered among the sagebrush. "Dug the hole with my own hands, carved the marker with my own knife. The whole town wanted to lynch me. But her father, Miguel Martinez, he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Said Sarah's spirit would find no peace if I died without trying to make amends." Clara's voice came soft as moth wings against glass. "So you became Thomas Whitmore. Bought this land with money I'd stolen from other banks. Built this house with hands that had taken life. Every board, every nail, every fence post was supposed to be my penance." He looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes holding the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. "I thought if I could save someone, if I could tend a dying woman with the same care I should have shown Sarah, maybe her spirit would forgive me. Maybe I could earn the right to sleep without hearing her voice." Clara stood then, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd recently rediscovered the gift of steady breathing. She walked to the window and looked out towards Sarah's grave, invisible in the darkness, but present as a pulse beneath the earth. "You wrote to me because you thought I'd die quickly," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. You married me because you believed my silence would go to the grave with me. Yes. Clara turned back to face him, and Thomas saw something in her expression that made his heart stutter. Not the revulsion he'd expected, not the fear he'd prepared for, and something deeper and more complex. Disappointment, perhaps, or a sadness that reached beyond his confession to touch something larger and more profound. "I wasn't supposed to be your wife," she said quietly. "I was supposed to be your final victim." The accusation hit him like a physical blow, all the more powerful because it carried the weight of absolute truth. Thomas had sought out Clara not for love or companionship, but as the final piece in his elaborate monument to guilt, a dying woman who would receive his care and carry his secrets to silence. Clara walked to the locked drawer then, her movements deliberate as a judge approaching a verdict. "Open it." Thomas's hands shook as he produced the key, as he turned the lock that had held his past captive for 8 years. Inside lay the evidence of Jesse Brennan's life. Wanted posters, newspaper clippings, letters from Sarah's mother that he never answered, and a small leather journal filled with his own handwriting. Pages and pages of confessions written to a dead woman, promises he'd tried to keep, descriptions of dreams where Sarah Martinez forgave him for the life he'd stolen from her. Clara lifted the journal with reverent hands, scanning pages that revealed the depth of Thomas's torment. Here was proof that his penance was real, that 8 years of isolation and honest work hadn't been performance, but genuine atonement. Yet she also saw the careful calculation in his courtship of her, the way he'd measured her dying against his need for absolution. "You've been writing to her all these years," Clara said, closing the journal gently. "Every night, telling her about the ranch, about the good I was trying to do, about how sorry I was. I thought," his voice broke completely then, "I thought if I cared for you the way I should have protected her, maybe Sarah would stop visiting my dreams." Clara set the journal on the table between them and looked at this man who'd saved her life for all the wrong reasons. She saw the genuine remorse carved into every line of his face, the real transformation that had turned Jesse Brennan into Thomas Whitmore. But she also saw the selfish core of his redemption, how he'd used her approaching death as a tool for his own spiritual comfort. "I need to think," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd faced mortality and emerged changed. "I need to walk outside where I can breathe." Thomas watched her go, knowing that when she returned, if she returned, everything between them would be different. The careful balance of their marriage, built on the assumption of her impending death, had crumbled the moment she'd drawn her first clear breath on Wyoming air. Clara stepped into the night, her recovered lungs filling with cold air that tasted of sage and possibility. Behind her, lamplight spilled from the kitchen window where Thomas sat alone with his open secrets. Ahead lay Sarah's grave, hidden in darkness, but calling to her like a voice across impossible distance. For the first time since her illness began, Clara felt truly alive, not because death had released its hold on her body, but because she finally understood the terrible weight of choosing how to live when someone else's blood has paid the price for your breath. She walked away from him that night, knowing he'd married her to ease his guilt over killing another woman. But when she came back at dawn, she had a plan that would either heal them both or destroy what little peace they'd found. Clara returned with the first light of dawn, her footsteps soft on the porch boards where Thomas sat hunched over his coffee like a man waiting for his own execution. He looked up at her approach with eyes red from sleeplessness and something deeper, the hollow exhaustion of a soul finally emptied of its secrets. "I've been thinking about Sarah," Clara said, settling beside him on the steps they'd shared as strangers pretending to be husband and wife. "About what she'd want from all this." Thomas set down his cup with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. "Clara, I understand if you need to. She wouldn't want you to hide anymore." Clara's voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who'd spent a night wrestling with angels. "And she wouldn't want me to be just another woman you tend until death makes your guilt manageable." The morning air hung between them, crisp with the promise of changing seasons. Thomas had spent 8 years building his penance in isolation, crafting his atonement from solitude and honest work. But Clara's survival had shattered that careful construction, leaving him exposed and uncertain in ways that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with learning how to live when redemption wasn't solitary anymore. "What are you saying?" he asked. Clara stood, brushing dust from her dress with movements that spoke of decision made and accepted. "I'm saying we're going to Millfield. Together. Today." The blood drained from Thomas's face until he looked like a man who'd seen his own grave marker. "Clara, no. You don't understand what you're asking. They'll hang me before we reach the church steps." Maybe. Clara's eyes held steel tempered by her own dance with death. Or maybe it's time to find out if 8 years of honest living means anything to people who've spent 8 years grieving. The journey to Millfield took 3 days by wagon. 3 days of silence punctuated by Thomas's growing terror and Clara's unwavering resolve. She'd packed their few belongings with the efficiency of someone who understood that some trips only go one direction. Thomas drove with the mechanical precision of a man approaching his own judgment, each mile marker a countdown to either redemption or destruction. Millfield had grown in the years since the robbery. New buildings lined streets. Thomas remembered running down with blood on his hands and Sarah's dying breath echoing in his ears. The bank still stood, its facade rebuilt but somehow familiar, like a scar that had healed but never forgotten the wound that made it. Clara found Miguel Martinez in his expanded general store, a man bent by grief but not broken, his eyes carrying the particular sadness of a father who'd buried his daughter. When Clara introduced herself and explained why they'd come, Miguel's weathered hands gripped the counter until his knuckles showed white as bone. "Jesse Brennan," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer spoken in darkness. "I wondered if you were still alive." Thomas stepped from behind Clara, hat in his hands, looking smaller than he had on his own ranch. "Mr. Martinez, I've come to what?" Miguel's voice carried 8 years of accumulated pain. "To say you're sorry? To make it right somehow." He studied Thomas's face, searching for the desperate young outlaw in these older, weathered features. "My Sarah is still dead, Mr. Brennan. Your regret doesn't resurrect the girl who should have married young Diego and given me grandchildren to spoil." Clara stepped forward then, her presence commanding attention in ways Thomas couldn't manage. "He's not here to make excuses or ask for forgiveness he hasn't earned. He's here to face what he did and accept whatever consequences you think justice requires. And you are his wife, Clara Whitmore." She met Miguel's eyes with steady resolve. "I was dying when I married him. Consumption. I came to Wyoming to die in peace and take his secrets with me. Instead, I lived. And when I lived, I learned the truth about who I'd married and what blood paid for the roof over my head." Miguel looked between them, seeing something in Clara's bearing that spoke of moral courage and hard choices. "You could have left him. Yes. I could have taken my recovered health and walked away from a man who'd used my approaching death for his own spiritual comfort." Clara's voice softened without losing its strength. "Instead, I'm here asking what Sarah Martinez would want from the man who killed her. Not what you want, Mr. Martinez, though your grief matters more than our peace. What would she want?" The question hung in the air like incense in an empty church. Miguel closed his eyes, and Thomas saw tears track down cheeks carved deep by 8 years of unanswered prayers. When the older man spoke again, his voice carried the weight of conversations held with tombstone and memory. She wanted him to stop running, stop hiding behind good deeds and careful distance. Miguel opened his eyes and looked directly at Thomas. "She wanted you to live with what you did instead of dying slowly from it." What followed wasn't the lynch mob Thomas had feared, but something both better and worse, a reckoning that demanded more than his death. Miguel led them to Sarah's official grave in the town cemetery, where a proper headstone marked earth that had been consecrated by community grief. Other graves surrounded hers, friends, family, a whole network of lives that had been touched by the young woman Jesse Brennan had killed in a moment of criminal stupidity. Thomas knelt in the dirt beside the grave, his knees sinking into earth that felt sacred as any church floor. He spoke Sarah's name aloud for the first time in 8 years, told her about the ranch he'd built with stolen money, about the nights he'd written letters to her memory, about marrying a dying woman because he thought his guilt deserved no living happiness. Clara knelt beside him, her hands joining his in the dirt. And together they planted wildflowers around Sarah's grave, the same flowers Clara had picked the day she discovered the hidden marker behind their house. As they worked, Thomas spoke his confession to anyone who would listen, telling the gathered townspeople about Jesse Brennan's crimes and Thomas Whitmore's attempted penance. Some wanted justice that looked like rope and tree branches. Others saw 8 years of honest living as payment enough for a moment's terrible mistake. But it was Miguel Martinez who offered the path forward, his voice carrying the authority of a father who'd learned to live with irreplaceable loss. You want to make amends? Really make amends? Miguel's words carved themselves into the afternoon air. Then stop hiding. Stay in Millfield. Work for the people you wronged. Let them see Jesse Brennan trying to earn the right to be Thomas Whitmore every single day. Clara felt her husband's hand tremble in hers, felt him wrestle with the choice between continued exile and public redemption. The dying woman he'd married to ease his conscience was gone, replaced by someone who demanded he face his sins in daylight instead of tending them in darkness. Yes, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind through cemetery grass. Yes, I'll stay. They found work in Millfield, Thomas repairing the bank he'd once robbed, Clara teaching in the school where Sarah Martinez might have taught if bullets hadn't stolen her future. Their love, born from deception and watered with tears, began growing into something real and chosen rather than desperate and temporary. Evenings found them returning to Sarah's grave, not as strangers bound by guilt and approaching death, but as two people learning to plant hope in soil salted with honest tears. Clara's recovery had saved more than her own life. It had forced Thomas to choose between comfortable penance and true redemption, between dying slowly from his sins and living fully despite them. The sun set over Millfield, painting the sky red as Sarah's blood. But for the first time in 8 years, Thomas Whitmore watched darkness fall without fearing the dreams it would bring. Beside him, Clara's steady breathing spoke of life reclaimed and love chosen freely, their shadows stretching across earth where wildflowers grew from seeds planted by hands that had learned to heal what they once broke.